Hello, and welcome to Sci-Fi Christian. I am Ben DeBono, here for the final Paradise Lost video, at least for now. Never know when you might revisit this. Now, I do know, if you watched the last video, you're probably thinking, wait a second, you said you were going to do a wrap-up video too. Well, as I read through Book 12, I don't actually have a ton to say on Book 12. So rather than doing two shorter videos, I'm going to do Book 12 here, and then we'll talk about some concluding thoughts, and we'll just do both those videos here together. Book 12, relatively brief, doesn't cover a ton of new ground. There's a couple things I do want to point out, and I want us to read the final concluding lines of the poem. But if you've read it, you know it kind of continues. Well, it does continue where we were in Book 11 with Michael walking Adam through the biblical narrative and showing him how God is going to be faithful to in the area of restoration. But unlike Book 11, where we went from Cain and Abel to Noah in hardly, we didn't get that far in a fairly substantial portion of the poem. Now we're going from Noah all the way forward through the rest of the Old Testament to Christ. So we cover a lot more ground, which is fine. It just, at least in this reading, for me, didn't lend a ton to discuss within there. But there are a couple things. So first, I actually want to start by reading the first three lines, because I think that even if we don't have a ton to discuss in the particulars, this is very helpful for kind of setting the table for what Milton is doing with this book, where he wants to leave us at the end of the poem, and also put in some more of his theological cards on the table, if I can be allowed to mix table metaphors as I just did. So the first three lines of Book 12. As one who in his journey baits at noon, though bent on speed, so here the archangel paused, betwixt the world destroyed and world restored. Now that final line there, betwixt the world destroyed and world restored, very, very profound, because on one level, it's simply functioning within the narrative. That Michael pauses here, literally the world is destroyed we just finished Noah and everything, and so the world's going to be restored. He's also pausing in the middle of his story of the redemption of humanity, so it works on that level. But it also, it also says something theologically about the place that humanity is in as a result of the fall. And this is well within the Christian tradition. All Christian Orthodox tradition would say this to one extent or another, that Christianity speaks of the present time as an in-between place. If you run in Christian circles, you may be familiar with terms like already but not yet, which is a slightly pithier way of saying what Milton's trying to say here, which is essentially that Christian theology teaches that we exist in an in-between time between the fall and complete redemption. And Christ's redemption that's given on the cross brings us into a state where we are already redeemed, but not yet in its full. Redemption is not yet felt in its fullness, as the world is still fallen and people still sin and all this good stuff and everything. So, not good stuff, obviously, but you know what I mean. So Milton's phrase here works on just many levels, and I admire so much what he does there. And it also speaks of where he's going to leave us at the end of this book very shortly, where Adam and Eve, we'll see in those final lines, they're kicked out of the garden. They do leave paradise. They're not happy about it. We've already seen them in great despair as a result of this judgment. But yet, because of what Michael shows Adam, there's a degree of hope. So this mixture of tragedy and hope is very much present at the end of this poem, very much present within the Christian tradition of sin and reconciliation. Very well done for Milton. So if you go back and read Book 12, read it with that line, betwixt the world destroyed and world restored. It's a line that sums up this book very perfectly, and also really the last couple books since we got past the point of the fall. This is what Milton is trying to get across. Okay, so then Milton kind of moves through all these stories like we talked about. There is stuff in there that covers some theological ground. A lot of it is kind of rehashing what we've already talked about in terms of his view on human freedom. There are some interesting notes there in the Tower of Babel scenes where he's talking about how tyranny is inevitable because of sin, but just because it's inevitable doesn't mean it's good. So we get into these whole complex paradoxes of the result of human sin. That, this is here because of your sin, but that doesn't mean you just accept it for what it is. So obviously political undertones there as well for Milton's time and ours. The one theological piece I do want to touch on is kind of a little over halfway through, well, about almost exactly halfway through the book, where we've talked a lot about Milton is not a Calvinist except for when he kind of is. Well, then we get these lines here right around line 285. I'm going to read from that to line 299 for us in a second. And here Milton starts to slip into Lutheran theology quite strongly. I'll explain what I mean after I read the excerpt. So, he says, "Doubt not but that sin will reign among them." This is Michael talking to Adam. "As of thee begot, and therefore was law given them to evince their natural pravity, by stirring up sin against law to fight, that when they see law can discover sin, but not remove, save by those shadowy expiations weak. The blood of bulls and goats, they may conclude some blood more precious must be paid for man, just for unjust, that in such righteousness to them by faith imputed, they may find justification towards God and peace of conscience, which the law by ceremonies cannot appease, nor man the moral part perform, and not performing cannot live." So, putting that into plainer English, the theological position that Milton is staking out here is, like I said, a very Lutheran position. If you've ever studied or been exposed to Lutheran thought on the topics of law and gospel, you've probably gotten a taste of this. And the general idea is that the Old Testament law is given to the Israelites, not in order to save them, but to show them how sinful they are, and to make them then look forward to a better redemption in the form of Jesus. Now, there's some basis for this in Christian theologies. Paul does talk in the book of Romans about how law is there to uncover sin, and the Pauline epistles talk a great deal about the effects of the law. Where this gets complicated, and I don't want to go too far down the theological rabbit hole here, because we can get very dense very fast, but where this gets complicated within the Christian tradition, especially more recently, if you are familiar with the new perspective on Paul and some of the debates about justification, is what precisely does Paul mean when he talks about law within the epistles? Is he referring to the law as in the Mosaic law with all of its sacrificial rituals and specific rules and everything, or is he more talking about the particular parts of the law that are used as ethnic boundary markers by Jewish Christians? Particularly brings up in Galatians and other books, circumcision is a very major one of these that create division between them and the Gentile Christians, thus dividing the church. very complicated topic. If you are interested in that, I would recommend some of N.T. Wright's work on it. His work of what St. Paul really said is a masterful bit of writing on there. But suffice to say that, this is very much a Protestant position. I think the New Perspective, while certainly not Catholic, is closer to a Catholic or Eastern Orthodox understanding of justification. Now, I say that Milton is more Lutheran here because, well, I think that you find variations of this throughout the Protestant tradition. It's stated as strongly as he is stating it here in Lutheranism specifically. So it just adds one more piece to the complex puzzle of where exactly did Milton land theologically, and what are we supposed to make of this. Okay, so I won't go too much deeper into that, but definitely did want to point that out as it goes to our ongoing discussion of where exactly does Milton land, and we'll maybe sum up some of those ideas when we get to our concluding thoughts here in just a couple minutes. So then really the last thing I want to touch on here in Book 12 is just this beautiful passage to close the poem of Adam and Eve leaving and the cherubim descending. So let me just read this and maybe we'll touch on a couple things here. This starts in line 626 and goes to the end in line 649. The archangel stood, and from the other hill to their fixed station, all in bright array, the cherubim, remember those guys, the four faces who came with Michael at the start of the last book, descended on the ground, gliding meteorous. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but like a meteor, as evening mist risen from a river o'er the marish glides, then gathers around fast as the Labradors homeward returning. High in front advanced the brandished sword of God, before them blazed fierce as a comet. So if you're familiar with Genesis, Genesis speaks of an angel with a flaming sword being left to guard the entrance to Eden, which with torrid heat and vapor as the Libyan air adust began to parch the temperate clime, whereat in either hand the hastening angel caught our lingering parents, and to the eastern gate led them direct, and down the cliff as fast to the subjected plain, then disappeared. They looking back, all the eastern side beheld of paradise. So late their happy seat, waved over by that flaming brand, the gate, with dreadful face thronged and fiery arms. Some natural tears they dropped, but wiped them soon. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and Providence their guide. They hand in hand with wandering steps, and slow through Eden took their solitary way. Very beautiful. Just a wonderful, wonderful passage to close this poem, and to go back to what we talked about a little bit ago with this whole betwixt the world destroyed and the world restored. I mean, you see it right there. Natural tears come to them and then they wipe them. The world is all before them, but yet they're kicked out of paradise. They're alone, but they're hand in hand. They're solitary way, but they're together. It's really a brilliant culmination of that theme that Milton introduces right there at the start of this book. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful way to end the poem. So that's Paradise Lost. Let's get to some concluding thoughts. And specifically, I want to not so much introduce new things here, but if you've watched all the way through this, which thank you for sticking through this, even if you only watched some of them. I know some of you have, and I did this first and foremost for my benefit of being able to have these videos to discuss it. But also, I hope some of you have enjoyed it and have benefited from it. So thank you for watching this. But I want to maybe touch on some of the issues that we have talked about throughout, some of the common questions that came up again and again and again, and see maybe what we can say about those now that we're at the end of the poem. So first, if we go all the way back to the very first video, we brought up this topic that's kind of pretty trendy when it comes to Paradise Lost. So question, is Satan truly the hero of this poem? Because you'll remember that we kind of could say, well, he's in the role that would be occupied by an Achilles or an Odysseus or an Aeneas. And so kind of he seems to be there. But is he truly meant to be heroic? Or can we truly sustain that reading? And I think that clearly we have to say, to be intellectually honest, that the answer is no. That reading doesn't sustain itself through the entirety of the poem. Satan all but disappears for long stretches of this poem. Yes, we see him in flashback scenes, but in the middle there. But besides that, I mean, he's very absent for a lot of this poem. He is the main character very much at the beginning, but we transition to Adam and Eve to the point where he's not present at all in these final two books and is largely absent from Book X except for his judgment down in hell when he returns to Pandemonium. So no, I don't think we could accurately say that that Satan is the hero of this poem. I think that there's some interesting intellectual ideas to play around with there. To what extent is Milton trying to comment on the heroic structure of a traditional poem? To what extent is maybe Satan's works meant to be commentary on an Achilles or Aeneas or Odysseus or other great heroes? So I think you could play around with some interesting theses there. I certainly don't mean to imply that we should just dismiss the idea entirely, but it seems to me that any notion that Satan is the hero of Paradise Lost, open and shut, either intentionally or accidentally, is maybe a theory best supported by, or most popular to those who read the first couple books and didn't get any farther. Because I think if you look at the poem as a whole, it's just not there. I just want to talk about, what do we make then of Milton's theology? Because we've talked about this a lot, especially from kind of Book III on, and obviously some places it came up more than others. Well, I think we got to say that Milton's theology is complex. It's a smorgasbord in many ways. I think, though, that we can say he is definitively within the Protestant tradition on most issues. I think outside of his very unorthodox view of the Trinity, which we've talked a great deal about, that the Son and the Father are not one in this poem. The Son is a created being. We have Arianism very much present in this poem. Outside of that, though, he is really within the Protestant tradition, and not only within it, but kind of all over the place in it. He very much rejects predestination. Very, very much so. Very much rejects any notion that the fall is preordained or Calvinistic election or something like that. So when it comes to predestination, election, he's very much an Arminian. But then we get to imputation of righteousness, as we saw, I think it was last time. Well, now he's very much within the Calvinist camp, and God does clearly have foresight of everything. But then he also has prevenient grace, as we talked about in either Book X or Book XI. I don't remember at the moment. I suppose I could find out here. It doesn't matter. But so he kind of bounces back and forth between those. And then in this book, we get a very strong Lutheran tinge to what he's saying there about law and gospel, law and grace. And so he's a very complex thinker. He certainly has a strong knowledge of Scripture. Whatever else we want to say about his theology, we can't fault him on that point. It's a very interesting way that he, much like the Arians did, he uses Scripture to support some of his unorthodox positions on the Trinity. It's his, what Christian Orthodoxy would call heresy or theological error, at the very least, is not born out of an ignorance in Milton. It's born out of a knowledge of Scripture, but a rejection of the church's traditional teachings on those issues. So Milton's theology, very complex. But I also want to talk within that, more specifically, about his take on God. Because remember, this is something we brought up several times as well. Is Milton's God just a horrible person, as has often been posited? Is he cruel, heartless, what have you? What do we make of Milton's God? And I want to stand up for Milton a little bit here, because I don't agree that Milton's God is unlikable. Milton's God is distant. That's a very different thing. Milton's God is not a terrible, judgmental, vengeful deity. He's a deity who is at arm's length to everyone but the sun. And I think that the fact that Milton's God comes off the way he does is a symptom of Milton's theology. I look at Milton's God as kind of proto-Barthian. What I mean by that is Karl Barth, the great 20th century German theologian. His view of God was a God who is fundamentally transcended from human consciousness. We cannot directly experience God except through an explicit act of revelation, which is felt most profoundly in Barthian theology through the person of Jesus Christ, through the incarnation. But outside of God taking that very deliberate act in, God is completely different. So, and that, I know that's a very basic explanation of Barthian's, or Karl Barth's theology, but we'll roll with it for the sake of simplicity. So if you were to take Karl Barth's position on God, on how God is so transcendent, so distant, except for when he meets us in Revelation, if you were to take that, but then pull Trinitarian theology out, and Barth is a strong Trinitarian, so I don't want to imply or cause confusion on that point. But if you were to combine Barth's view with Milton's rejection of the Trinity, you get Milton's view of God, where God in this poem never directly interacts with his creation. I mean, think about it. And the most stunning example of this to me is when Adam and Eve and the serpent are all interrogated after the eating of the fruit, after the fall. And in Scripture, in Genesis, that's very clearly God down there. And in Paradise Lost, it's very clearly the Son. So the Son is very much God's representative. He isn't God in Milton's thought, but he becomes almost indistinguishable from him at some point, because Milton's God is so transcendent and distant, and he only acts through that intermediary. Or through Michael or something like that. But even we see this in the rebellion at heaven, where God doesn't kick Satan out of heaven, the Son does. The Son is sent by God to end the war. Michael and Gabriel are sent by God to fight the war. And so God remains this arm's length apart throughout Paradise Lost, and because we don't have a Trinitarian understanding to then allow the Son to be revealing God to us in the same way that a Trinitarian view of theology would say that Jesus does, we're left with a God who seems very closed off in many ways in Milton's Paradise Lost. But that doesn't mean he's cruel and vengeful. So I think that this would be an area where the lack of theological understanding is very much impacting the literary criticism that's taken place on this issue. I think with a better understanding of the Christian tradition on the Trinity, as well as Milton's rejection of that tradition, that's when we get to, that's the only way you can interpret Milton's view of God in this poem. You have to take that lens. So, hopefully that's clear. That to me is a very fascinating issue, though, and one that would be worth further discussion and further study. And then the last thing I want to touch on here is just the question of, well, where does this work rank then in the Western canon in terms of importance? Clearly I am a great admirer of this poem. I wouldn't have done however many hours this video series has been if I wasn't. I think this is a very important poem. It's beautifully, beautifully written. I think that the irony of it is that if you're familiar with Scripture, you know that the fall of Satan is not very explicit within the Bible. There's allusions to it here and there, but it's not explicit. But if you ask people to, the casual Christian, if you were to ask him or her, what does the Bible teach about the fall of Satan, they'd probably rattle off something that sounds very much like Paradise Lost. So this is a poem that is not only influenced by theology, but has influenced, at least at a casual or lay level, theological thinking of what the Bible actually teaches in the church. I think this is a poem that stands at the crux of Christendom and classical mythology. It manages to interact with both very well. Its use of language is exemplary. Milton, the beauty of his passages, is right up there with Shakespeare for his ability to harness the English language into something simply transcendent and profound. So, I'm nowhere near qualified to say whether or not this is the greatest work in the English language or how it stacks up against, Hamlet or something like that, because I'm a great admirer of those as well. But it certainly is a work that deserves to be studied, it deserves to be read, and it deserves to be loved. I mean, this isn't a work to just study and then it's dry, it's boring, but it's important, so you have to study it. No, this is a work you can really dive into in a passionate way and enjoy at a very profound, not only intellectual but emotional level. It is the epitome of great literature. And that's why it's been so worth doing these videos here for you guys. So again, I hope you've enjoyed them. Thank you for watching. It's been a long journey. I didn't anticipate Paradise Lost taking this long when I started. I didn't anticipate any of the videos being as long as they ultimately grew to, but it has been a great deal of fun. I've enjoyed doing this. We're going to do it again with another work. I haven't thought about what yet exactly, but if you have some stuff you think that would lend itself nicely to a video series like this, by all means let me know. You comment, send me an email, whatever. Ben@thescifichristian.com. And we'll definitely do stuff like this in the future. Not necessarily right away. We need a little breather because this has been a fair amount of work to try and do on a weekly basis. I haven't always been 100% perfect with getting it out every single week, but it's been a fair amount of work and everything. But well worth it. Very enjoyable. So it's been an absolute pleasure to go through this great poem with you all. Again, thank you for watching. Stay tuned to the Sci-Fi Christian for our podcast, our blog posts, all the good stuff. And yes, I am Ben DeBall. And I will see you next time. I'm signing off. Goodbye.